The Army War College's recent findings on climate change point to a scary future, one the Army is ill-equipped to deal with. One group has advice for the Army on how to prepare. Francesco Femia is founder of the Center for Climate and Security. He talked with Tom Temin.
There's a lot in the report, though I'd say there are two major findings. First, the Army War College report on climate change implications for the U.S. Army notes that the Department of Defense is precariously underprepared for the national security implications of climate change-induced global security challenges. I think that's a very interesting and perhaps even extraordinary finding. I think the second part of the report, I think that's worth noting, is the assertion that the U.S. Army, more specifically to the Army, is precipitously close to mission failure concerning hydration of its force in contested arid environments, basically in dry places where the Army operates. That's some pretty strong language. What I would say is, though that sounds quite dire, it is consistent, I think, with the military's longstanding concern about climate change and also the military's growing concern about climate change over time, including during this administration. So it doesn't surprise me, these assessments, but I think they do point to some serious concerns that the DoD has and the Army has about climate change.
And in terms of the global situation where the Army might have to be deployed, what are some of those expected effects as the future comes closer?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, hydrating the force, as the report mentions, is very important in dry places where the U.S. military and the Army operates, whether that's in the Middle East or North Africa or in other places in the future that are arid environments. And so that is going to be a real concern as climate change makes water resources less available. So I think that's one sort of operational concern that the U.S. Army has. But on a more strategic level, I think there is certainly a concern in the Army, but also across the services, that climate change and its impacts on water are likely to drive more instability, political instability and conflict in a number of areas, both that it's already involved in or operating in, and also that it might be called upon to operate in. And that might stress the capacity of our armed forces as well. So I think those are, kind of the two levels of concern I think that you would see from the Army and that this report identifies.
And what about other militaries, say China or Russia? Are they similarly affected by these same trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think every country and their military forces are in one way or another affected by climate change because climate change affects the entire geostrategic landscape. What I would say specifically about Russia and China is that though there are certainly risks that they'll face from water resource stress, China in particular, Russia will face significant risks in its Arctic regions with permafrost loss, et cetera. But I would also say that from our perspective, and I think the members of the U.S. military would that focus on this issue might see this as well, is that in many ways China and Russia are taking advantage of certain climate-driven dynamics, particularly in the Arctic. So Russia sees that as an opportunity to expand both its military influence and its commercial interests, and China also sees itself as a near Arctic nation, and so is taking advantage of those changes as well to be more present in the Arctic. And so I think those are that's really important for the U.S. and the U.S. military to be concerned about because there's strategic implications for the United States. And then I'd also add that countries like China see an opportunity to expand their influence by supporting countries in its own region, but also outside of the Asia Pacific region, like Africa and Latin America, in their efforts to address climate change. And when they see that the U.S. is not sort of similarly supporting countries, then they see that as a strategic opportunity. So I think those are all concerns on the strategic level that I would point out.
We're speaking with Francesco Femia, founder of the Center for Climate and Security. And getting back to the Army itself, I want to talk about the two issues separately. What should the Army be doing, in your opinion, to prepare for the strategic issues related to climate change? And then we'll talk separately about the hydration question.
Sure. I think on the strategic level, I think the Army, first of all, as evidenced by this report, but also, I think, there, past concerns from U.S. Army officials on this subject, they're well aware I think, of climate change implications on the geopolitical environment and on the forest. And so, the awareness, I think, is already there. And I imagine they'll continue to study this issue so that they're fully, capable of being ready for any changes that climate change might precipitate. So I think there's a lot that's been done by the services, including the Army, on understanding the issue, studying the issue, and figuring out how it affects the forest. I think what the next step really though is to figure out what kinds of changes and investments need to be made by the Army in when thinking out 10, 20, 30 years about what the Army, what the operating environment is going to look like, and how they're going to operate in those environments, and also how they're going to, the U.S. Army is going to support its allies and its partners in these regions. And so that might take significant changes in how in how we're positioned, and the kinds of investments we make. For example, in support of resilience in different countries, including military capabilities for dealing with natural disasters, for example. There are a lot. These are big questions, so there's no one simple answer. But I think those are the next step. I think for the Army is, okay, we understand this problem. We can see where it might lead to big changes in the strategic environment in the future. Now, what kinds of planning and investment do we need to make? I think the Army wants to do that. I think they feel constrained in a way by sort of the political climate on this issue, which is really unfortunate because that sort of forces a blind spot on the Army's ability to plan for these issues.
And with respect to having enough water for troops operating in arid areas, is there anything specific there has to be something they can do? Bring lots of bottles or tankers or what?
Yeah, so I think the Army War College, recommend a number of, just includes in this report a number of recommendations for how to improve its hydration capacity. And they highlight, for example, that their brigade combat teams have not been able to support their own water needs since 2015. So there's a real dependency issue there. And so I think the fix, though, just to speak broadly about, I think the kinds of things that need to happen is both technical in the sense of investing in the technologies that might be necessary for desalination and water conservation, et cetera, and investing in that kind of resilience to make them more capable of operating with less water, basically. But more broadly, I think the Army needs to argue for bigger strategic thinking about how forces are going to operate in places that might even be uninhabitable in the future based on climate change. Because you can try the technical fix as much as you want, but there's going to be some serious sort of uninhabitability issues in some of these places, and that's a big deal. But I think the Army does recommend a number of technical investments to explore advanced technologies for capturing, for example, ambient humidity and recycle water for reuse, et cetera. But I think more broadly than the technical fix, there needs to be a change in thinking in the U.S. government about how serious this is and how serious it's going to affect our ability to operate and also our military readiness.
Francesco Femia is director of the Center for Climate and Security. We'll post this interview along with a link to more information at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.